Okay, so we're in the 1830s. We're in Europe, and I think one thing that's important to remember that, for example, in France, once the theory of the French Revolution gets instantiated in the laws, it's illegal to have any kind of a private association. Right? Why? Because private association is a corporate body. They don't say it this way, right? But it's a corporate body that exercises authority. And you can't have any private body that exercises authority other than the state. In the legal theory that's getting worked out in the liberal system, in the liberal Enlightenment system. So, as different groups this is why, for example, in part, these reading clubs, these study circles, the salons are very popular. Or sometimes, people they're looking for other avenues to meet. And a lot of times all sorts of different people would meet. Really, weddings and funerals would be occasions for serious discussions. Or they'd have men's night, right? They'd have something like that, like a meal. We get together for a meal because you can't ban people from getting together to eat, right? But they would get together for a meal, and at the meal they would then talk about whatever ideas they wanted to talk about. But technically, if they were meeting for a purpose to discuss something, it was illegal. So in France, in Germany, in Italy, you start to get these secret societies. And especially the radical secret societies, they're part of this effort. They become very much this part of this effort to try to basically. It's just like Plato describes in Book 2 of the Republic, right? They're setting up clubs behind the scenes, so that they can somehow promote whatever is their version of justice, to have that be what justice is. Yes.
Right, it's the Republican radicals who are now in control, and it's the more conservative groups who are forming these secret societies.
Well, no, actually, it's the liberals it's the moderate liberals that tend to be in control. Well, first of all, no one really. Once law is in place, it's hard to change it. Right. So a lot of the laws that were put in place during the French Revolution and during Napoleon's reign, for example, there can be no private associations. There can be no private schools. There can be no, for example, there can be no Catholic university in France to this day that gets accredited.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's
there's a Catholic university, but it doesn't have state accreditation. Right? So, because why? Because the state can grant existence to something, but if the state doesn't grant it existence, it can't exist.
Yeah, so just by who's in control.
So in other words, that law. So when Charles X comes to power in the 1820s, he can overlook the fact that the Catholics are setting up their own schools. He just doesn't enforce the law.
He never changed it.
But he doesn't have enough power to change. He doesn't have enough clout to change it. Right. In fact, one of the reasons there was the coup against him is because he was threatening to kind of try to restore monarchical power, where he could, as monarch, just change things.
But the secret societies are more conservative groups or liberal groups?
They tend to be more radical liberal.
And because those groups, because any private.
Because basically the moderate liberals are almost always in the government.
Got it.
So they really don't have need for a secret society, because they can just use the Chamber of Deputies to. Yeah.
Would you consider these Catholic study circles a secret society or not?
You could.
That's not how you understand it.
Well, I think the model I'm going to give here. Let me explain the model, and then one of the societies that's commonly given is there's lots of secret societies. Many of them seem to be based on this one called the Carbonari. Well, actually, the Carbonari were formed. Carbonari means the coal bunches, right? Or burning coal. They actually begin in southern France on the French, Swiss, Italian border in that part of France. And They have different names. There's one secret society called the Red and the Black. They spread throughout because Napoleon he does create certain lines of communication. So when the Carbonari forms, they very quickly spread down into southern Italy, into Naples, into Sicily. They go up into France, and the Carbonari. Basically, the idea of the Carbonari is where you get your power from, right? So it's like an image of the burning coal is the image of what will make all things free. But in the Carbonari, in the secret societies, sometimes this is still the case in Italy. Some of these secret societies they'll blend together Catholic imagery with their kind of Masonic goals, right? So they look Catholic oftentimes. They'll have Catholic symbols, but they won't have any kind of Catholic ideals. But the idea of the Carbonari is you burn wood, and that creates charcoal. And the charcoal is a higher form. And this is a symbol of how in your society, in the society of the Carbonari, you'll be tested in some way. And from that will come a higher form of freedom. Is there secrecy in rituals? There's secrecy, yes, because, for example, in France, there has to be secrecy because it's illegal to have them. Are there rituals? Yes, because oftentimes they are kind of an imitation of religious practices. They don't believe in Christ, but they do imitate things that are part of the church. And they basically see themselves as forming to make pledges to fight tyranny in the circumstances where they form. So one, for example, that's formed in France, when Lafayette is they think Lafayette was part of it or was like ahead of it, was the Liberal Union. And its symbol, for example, was the key, but the key was magnetic. Right? Somehow the magnetism of the key is going to attract people to freedom. Someone who started secret societies in Spain was this guy named Buonarroti. Buonarroti was a big kind of. He became also a big Italian nationalist. There was a fellow named Follen, Follen. I forget his first name now. K. Follen. He started one in Germany. But something that happens by the 1830s is that a number of the people who are the leaders of these secret societies, they have a meeting at one point in Geneva, and they say we should basically have international societies, right? Because from D'Alembert, from the old days and whatnot, they get the idea that we need an international, for example, international student union, something like that, right? This is the time in Europe where you start to get what becomes fraternities. And they even make their way over to the United States, fraternities and sororities, because you use the pretext of like providing housing for students as a way of organizing in the basement your secret rituals. And again, the idea here is to promote liberty. In many of these secret societies, they would have special ceremonies where they would burn or destroy any books that were deemed too anti-liberal.
They'd have book burning parties.
Yeah. Yeah, try that at Princeton. And you could just say, we're just imitating the liberal secret societies of the 1800s. We're just being true to our spirit, true to our founding fathers. Then another form of secret society that forms in this time are sports societies and gymnastic societies. Sports and gymnastics, yes. Because why? A gymnastic display was an occasion. No one could argue against a gymnastic display, but it would be an occasion on the side to have meetings to promote revolutionary activity. And also, there were certain Rousseauvians who argued that gymnastics is a form of exercise that's going back to nature. The circle, for example, the rings have a kind of mystical meaning. And rings and circles, doing things in circular form, circular motions, that's a natural activity. And these are the kind of, you can have events around the sporting events that, that basically gather people together where you could potentially have a happening and a breakthrough moment for freedom. Right? Other secret societies are much more political in orientation. In Russia, there's the Decembrists. The Decembrists form actually because the government in Russia by the 1790s tends to be very liberal, very Enlightenment inspired, and the Decembrists are oftentimes more conservative. They want to save the motherland, they want to save the Tsar, right? I mean, they're there for the motherland, the Tsar, and orthodoxy, right? That's kind of the. There are some, obviously, also in Russia that become more radical. There's youth societies that form, right? Young Frenchmen for Freedom. In the 1960s, Bill Buckley will form the Young Americans for Freedom, right? Yeah. You're part of a secret society, right? A lot of times especially the youth societies, they would have bizarre rituals of like hazing rituals, things like that. When they were discovered in the 1820s, for example, if they were discovered in places like France or Spain or whatnot, they would generally get crushed. So I guess the point is to kind of paint this picture that whether the government is a monarchy in Europe or whether it's even a moderate liberal government in Europe, and this is the case both in, I think it's France and in Spain, you start to see kind of a lot more thought and effort, and you get occasional flare-ups of small revolutions. So for example, if we go to Spain, if you remember, I think it was around 1814 or so, Napoleon lets Ferdinand VII take power again in Spain. And between 1814 and his death in 1830, basically, he's trying to reestablish his monarchy. But all of his advisors at this point, one of the deals that he makes to get power back is he agrees that they let his advisors be moderate liberals. And one of the things Ferdinand VII has to decide to do during this time is, number one, how to govern Spain, what to do with the church. Number two, what to do with the former empire in Latin America. Because the British are making inroads into the former empire, he also sees that just because of the revolution and what Napoleon's administrators in Spain did, that there's also now a lot of radical liberals in Latin America, Masons, moderate liberals. Chaos is kind of breaking out there as well. And so what he decides to do by 1820, I think it's 1820, let's just say around 1820, he decides, I think I have enough strength to try to reestablish my colonial ties back with Mexico and the different, I can basically take power back from the different juntas. If you remember, when kind of the Spanish Empire falls apart, these local juntas, which are just whoever happens to have weapons at the time and have power, I mean, they basically form the governments of these provinces, which by the end of the 1820s, I think that's the foundation of most of the states in Latin America, right? Yeah.
This was named Ferdinand who denounced the Cadiz.
Yeah. He denounced the Cadiz Constitution, yes. So around 1820 or so, he decides to put the army back together and to send the army to Latin America to rebuild the empire. So the army meets in Cadiz. And when the army is meeting in Cadiz and training everybody to go to Latin America, they revolt. They revolt against Ferdinand VII. Because as it turns out, the army is full of both radical and moderate Enlightenment generals. And there was 3 years in the 1820s where there's full revolt in Spain. And in fact, France, the French send troops, the Russians send troops.
Rush?
Yeah, like everybody, because this revolt, if it spreads, I mean, everybody's nervous about, because also in this revolt, I think in Wikipedia it says the king had difficulties with the revolutionaries or something like that. But this is one of the first times, I mean, going back to almost to the Middle Ages, where you get massacres of priests and nuns in Spain, right? So during these 3 years, there's several thousand priests and nuns that are massacred by the moderate and radical liberals, and so like this kind of causes a little bit of shockwave. I mean, I got a little bit Ferdinand VII's attitude is, look, I can lay aside priests and nuns and close monasteries, right? But you guys can't just kill them, right? Outright. So when he finally they do put down this revolt. But then Ferdinand II in 1830 on his deathbed, we were just talking about changing your will, right? So Ferdinand VII on his deathbed, he changes the law of Spain. He wants his daughter Isabella to succeed. His daughter Isabella is like 3 years old, right? But he wants her to be the queen because she's a beautiful little girl, right? So he changes the rightful heir is Charles. And
Charles X?
No, a different Charles. Charles IV, I think. Different branch of the family. So he changes the law so that Charles will not be the heir, but instead Isabella will be the heir. And he agrees to let basically moderate and radical liberals surround Isabella. And because she can't rule as a 3-year-old. So her cabinet basically for the first 20 years of her life are these moderate and radical liberals who use her as a figurehead to really kind of crack down on the church. And in the 1820s, during this revolt, there was a group. This was a conservative secret society that formed called the Apostolicos.
Nice.
Right? And they were like, we're all for Catholic doctrine. We want a Catholic king, and we want loyalty to the Pope. Like these are the 3 requirements.
I love it.
Of whoever's ruling in Spain, and they do fight and they help to put down the revolt. And then what happens in the late 1820s is there's another group of Catholics, and So in the 1830s, what happens is in 1830, when this is found out, a lot of the Apostolicos, they rebrand themselves, and they call themselves Carlistas. Right? So they're guys who are upset. They're not anti-Isabella because she's Isabella. I mean, they are a little bit. I mean, and they actually in 1830 they go into civil war against the regime of Isabella. But they're not going. I mean, they're against the change of the law. That obviously Charles should have been the king, and he was a Catholic and he was faithful and he wanted to be loyal to the Pope and implement what he thought were good Catholic laws. And one of the strongholds of the Carlistas to this day is Pamplona. But they're very prominent even in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. But this is the beginning of this kind of pattern of Spanish history. Really goes back to then. It doesn't start in the 1930s. Of there being like strong Catholic groups that basically, whenever freedom is granted, the radicals and the moderate liberals use freedom to really hammer the church, right? To kick out the religious orders, to butcher nuns and priests and whatnot. And so Spain is afflicted during the 19th century by this kind of civil unrest. It's not just that they're kind of a closed shop, right, to the rest of the world, but there's a lot of civil unrest in Spain. And a lot of it has to do with, it's the same, we've talked about this mentality before, right? The liberals, whether they're moderate or radical, they realize I mean, they basically, they're always faced with this problem of, it's just a different set of circumstances. If you're talking about Spain or Italy or France or Belgium or even Germany than the United States. And so there's something you got to do to get rid of this kind of mass weight of Catholicism. You can't just have like freedom. You got to make them free, right? You got to do something to make the society free. There's like 6 hands up. Yes.
So the radical liberals were in favor of Isabella?
Yeah, because they could basically, she was their figurehead.
What, is that simply because the Carlists were in favor of?
Well, Ferdinand made the deal with them that they could be the administrators for her if they were willing to change the laws so that she could be the queen someday.
So the Carlists didn't really care about her. It was just basically her government was a moderate liberal nonsense.
Right. Right. Yes.
And I guess, are you saying with that last comment that this is the same situation as in France, that if the electorate, if you had like an election and everyone could vote, they would have sort of voted in the...
I mean, most likely, yeah. I mean, most likely if...
Okay. So
Yeah,
that-
60 to 70% would probably still vote for Charles to be king if they had the vote. Yeah.
So, was there much central organization for, I guess, the radicals, for instance, trying to get those breakthrough moments among the different countries?
Well, it seems like there was. It seems like, yes, there was contact between, because also they start calling for the need for an international
Oh no.
society. Yeah, they do.
Like the international.
And but that's eventually what, yeah. But it takes between 1830 and 1848 for that to kind of gel and kind of mature as an
It's like a
idea.
sector, sort of.
Yeah. So then, going back now to France real quick. And remember, 1830, you get the July Monarchy. The July Monarchy is a combination of, you could say that the fundamental principles are, if you want to vote, get rich, right? It favors very much the business class, especially the wealthy business class. It favors very much kind of imperial, in as much as France was involved in imperial expansion. Nothing like the British, but imperial expansion nonetheless. And by 1833, so just 3 years in, the liberal radicals are deeply disappointed with the July Monarchy. They start calling, like Buonarroti, this guy in Italy, he calls Lafayette a bumbling mummy. Right? And so this leads to a number of radical movements that where people, in some one way or another, they try to define themselves against moderate liberalism. The first is the formation. You see the first formation in the 1830s of democratic nationalism. Right? That in other words, people start arguing, well, you know what? All this franchise of 1%, 2%, that's all phony. And it doesn't work in the interest of the nation, actually. It works in the interest of the leisure class or the wealthy. There'll be a great political philosopher, social scientist, Thorstein Veblen. He writes in I think he dies in the 1920s. But he has a wonderful book called The Theory of the Leisure Class, in which he basically describes, look, at this point in history, you essentially have all over the world alternative government. Because you have this class of people that aren't really attached to any nation. They're just parasites. And they basically buy land, their principal objective is natural resources and agriculture, because that's the basis of the economy. So what they try to do is they try to buy and control the chokeholds of the economy for every nation, right? But they're actually not loyal to any nation. So he basically says, I don't know if he uses the word parasite, but the way he describes them, it sounds a lot like they're parasitical, because they suck the resources and the wealth from every nation, and so that the people of the nation don't get any of the benefit from their resources.
Is this a group, a society? T. Vebler started?
Thorstein Veblen is a great political philosopher, social scientist of the 1890 to 1920. In 1905 he called the First World War. I mean, he was one of these social scientists, like when he said things, a lot of times it actually happened. Like he kind of somehow knew what was going on. In 1914 he said, he kind of knew by 1914 that there would be a Second World War. And then the Second World War, he said, Germany will probably be more radical and more militaristic. And then at the end of the First World War, he said he was, like, as soon as he saw the Treaty of Versailles, he wrote an article on it and said, this is a formula to create, there's an intention here to create a more radical Germany, to justify an even greater war, to humiliate them completely, to bring them into submission. I mean, he kind of saw it. Like he was a little bit prophetic, I think, in some of these things. So anyway, but this kind of critique is beginning already I'm sure it's in England as well, but it's especially against the July monarchy. And one of the reactions against this kind of bourgeois, so-called free market economics for the wealthy, and imperialism, like militaristic imperialism and whatnot, right? One reaction against that is democratic nationalism. Okay. The second is you get the first birth of they take an idea from Napoleon and they try to you get these secret societies that start to use public relations and whatnot to get a breakthrough moment that will basically try to unite all the free nations of Europe together, right? So you get the first seeds, I think. There's no like definite idea of the EU, but you start to see in the 1830s in some of these secret societies people thinking, well, the only, in other words, Napoleon thought the only way the continental system will work is if we get a big enough. You got to get enough countries that have all the mineral resources necessary for an economy together, right? Well, this idea kind of matures to where some radical liberals start to argue that, well, only if you can unite all of only if you can give freedom to all the nations of Europe, and then unite them as free nations. I mean, freedom in the no despotism, no ignorance, no priestcraft, no black reaction, right? Freedom, right? That kind of freedom, right? Only if you get that and you unite them all together will you actually have a free Europe. Then there's a third kind of radical, and they get their name from a guy named Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a British industrialist who kind of at some point starts to feel guilty about his industrialism. And he basically says, we wealthy people, we have to take a responsibility for the poor, right? We have to do things to advance and develop the poor. And they asked him, well, what do you propose? What name should we give to your project? And the name he gave to his project was socialism. Right? So you start to get all these secret societies in the 30s that start to emerge on the principle of you won't really have true freedom until the poor are free, right? And but the first guy that really proposes was an industrialist, and he actually proposed that it be done not by government but by people like him taking the initiative to have like social concern.
Is he got the big farm?
Pardon?
Is he got the big farm?
Yeah.
Like the work-
And eventually he ends up, I think, in the U.S. or he has influence in the U.S. as
Not far
well.
from here, right? New Harmony, Indiana.
Yeah.
I've heard.
New Harmony, Indiana is one of the...
Next Wednesday.
You could...
What is this?
It's a socialist. He started his one of his
Oh,
utopian
okay.
societies, not too far from here.
Then you start to... The fourth kind of secret society you get is a society that starts to be dedicated to holy violence. Right? one guy here, well, two fellows here that are interesting. Mazzini is in Italy. And then another Polish guy, Koziuko.
Oh wow. There's a statue from in Chicago.
Yeah, and there's not far from here is in Koziuko County
Yeah.
in Indiana. So anyway, these guys basically say, look, freedom will only really come about if we follow the example of the United States of America. There, they were devoted to kind of holy terrorism, to throw off the British, who were, Tories, right? And they were committed to kind of a holy terrorism, guerrilla warfare, total violence, in order, and that's what sanctified both the American Revolution and the American founding. And this is what needs to be imitated everywhere, right? We need to take the good example of the Americans who showed us how to break the rules of warfare, commit acts of terrorism, hassle the enemies at every place and every moment in society. And but then again, the Americans, they were able to establish, which you can all see on your dollar bills. Right? They were able to establish the new order of the ages, right? The one that would supplant in secula, that would supplant the church, which was born in secula seculorum. And they have given us hope that we can use holy violence to establish truly free systems and free nations. So Mazzini was a big promoter of this in Italy. Koziuko was a big promoter of this in Poland, using holy terrorism in order to free Poland from the Russian oppressors. And as it turns out, Koziuko, he was a natural enlightenment guy. I mean, he might have been a baptized Catholic, but I don't think he had many Catholic ideas in his arsenal of political philosophy. One of the fellows that Koziuko met and became friends with was a guy named Bakunin.
Oh no. Anarchist.
And he convinced Bakunin that he should adopt the tactics of the American revolutionaries in promoting kind of anarchy everywhere to bring about a breakthrough moment that would bring about freedom.
Bakunin was a friend of Buonarroti's.
Also.
He followed him.
I mean, a lot of these guys all knew kind of each other. I mean, there was...
Well, do they know each other? Do they write each other? Or
I mean, they met in secret societies. They met at gymnastic events, or they met... a lot. At one point, you'll see they all go to... A lot of these guys go to England.
oligarch conference?
So Mazzini became good friends with Prati, a guy named Prati, in Rome. There's a neighborhood in Rome right next to the Vatican called the Prati district. They built it in the 19th century, and the idea of building it was that from no standpoint in the Prati district could you see St. Peter's, right? They wanted a place right next to St. Peter's, right next to the Vatican, where you couldn't actually see the Vatican. Because that was supposed to be the model for how Europe was going to grow. But again, Mazzini and Prati advocated complete guerrilla war in Italy, imitating the Americans as a way of achieving freedom. Because you could only do this because the church was the papacy, the church, was so rooted. Every time they had a democratic election, the people would vote to stay with the papal states. Right? So that was kind of problematic. But through holy violence, you could maybe break them from that. Actually, Buonarroti balked at this idea, to give him a little bit of credit. Right? He thought that this was too much.
He was down for a lot of other things, though. He was down for a lot of other different
Yeah. Now, by the way, Garibaldi also became part of the Mazzini and Prati little group there in Italy. The first time Garibaldi tried total war in Italy from 1830 to 1833, he completely failed. So, as most failures do, he brought his show to Latin America, where he basically tried to commit to total war against the church in Latin America, until eventually, I think in the 1850s, he goes back to Italy, and then is part of the forced unification of Italy.
This So Buonarroti and Mazzini, were they fighting for the independence of papal states, or were they fighting for the unification of it?
No, they're fighting for an Italy where there's no papacy.
No priestcraft.
No, they're naturalists. Yeah, they're.
They're not. Italian unification is not very hard.
Well, unification doesn't take place. It doesn't get going seriously until the 1850s,
Okay.
and then it finally takes place during the First Vatican Council in the 1870s. So, anyway, so these are the various like secret societies. On the Catholic front, we spoke the other day about the condemnation of Lamennais, but on the Catholic front, I think it's interesting to note that while Lamennais came to a tragic end, his disciples actually they laid a lot of groundwork in many countries for what became both a political movement that was kind of Catholic, because you start to see that. Well, I'll say something about that in a minute, but also a kind of cultural revival in Catholicism that really leads to the revitalization of the church in almost every country in Europe between 1830, 1840, and about 1960, I would say. You see this revitalization of the church in almost every country in Europe. One fellow in France was this great bishop, a guy named Gerbet. He started a journal, and through this journal, he basically wanted to give. The goal of this journal was to give every Catholic in France a Catholic university education, but through reading this journal, right? He promoted in this journal also the need for regular reception of the confession and the Eucharist, because this was essential to maturing as a person. Both in Germany and Italy, there are disciples or followers of Lamennais that basically start to give an impetus to neo-scholasticism. I mean, a renewed interest in the study of St. Thomas and trying to basically see that St. Thomas is a guide. There's a fellow in France, a guy named Guéranger. He starts to renew interest in the study of the classics, and then one of his disciples, a guy named Ming, actually starts to study these great volumes of the Fathers of the Church. And they get this scholar in the Netherlands interested in their project, who starts to do this also in the Netherlands, Joaquin Brooks. Yes.
You're joking.
I'm not joking.
Wait,
But Dutch patristic scholar of the 19th century.
I didn't think you could put these two names together.
So anyway, a big representative of this movement in both the revival of Thomism and also the development of Catholic social doctrine in the 19th century is a guy named Tapparelli. If I remember correctly, he's also influential in starting the magazine Civita Cattolica.
Oh, that one.
Which in those days was works right alongside the Pope. It wasn't the Pope's magazine, but they worked right alongside the Pope, basically.
These days it does too.
Pardon?
It does these days too, right?
It may have returned to that under this Pope, yeah. But anyway, here's basically Tapparelli's, I think, assessment of the situation in the 1830s. We got to move away from Lockean naturalism. We got to move away from empiricism, from Kantianism, Rousseauianism, at least as far as forming a foundation. We got to get a foundation on which we can stand. And that foundation should be Christ and the Gospels. And in the end, he really says Aquinas, because Aquinas is the true summary of the patristic tradition. And really, it's really hard to find somebody better than Aquinas, or smarter than Aquinas, let's put it that way. At the same time, we should be open to all the data, right? So Tapparelli and the Thomists, they weren't saying that we should just go back to Aquinas or go back to the third. They weren't traditionalists in that sense. We should just go back to the 12th century and do everything that they did, right? We need to be open to. There can be a lot of times, if virtue is true, right? If the theory of virtue is true, even though someone's like just a crazy whatever, they can still have good habits and do good, right? If virtue is true, it's true whether you recognize it or not, right? So there can be all sorts of crazy people, and there could be all sorts of innovations that are made, right? Technology is not bad in and of itself. There could be innovations that are made, like putting cocaine in an after-dinner liqueur. That could be a great innovation. I mean, it helped 2 popes work long hours, you know? Vin Mariani. Right? So innovation could be good. Right?
Cocaine, man.
Here's the Pope in an advertisement for Mariana.
Yeah.
found it?
Yeah. Right? So innovation could be good.
It's Leo XIII.
And also, there could be elements in these various crazy philosophies of 1700 to 1830. There could be things in them where there was some insight that was made that could be, but we have to begin with the foundation of Aquinas and the Gospels, and that has to be the lens through which we evaluate. And we have to be more judicious than the Catholics of the 18th century were about accepting these ideas or not. We need the natural law. And we need the natural law for a very important reason. It's the only way we're going to arrive at, Toporelli says, social justice. He uses that word. He uses the word. Toporelli was a social justice warrior.
Yeah.
SJW.
No, he wasn't.
He also began making the argument that actually the best help that can be given to lay people is to point out errors. Right? Because if you point out the error, they're free in everything else. If you understand the spirit of pointing out errors, then that gives people that gives them a kind of sense of freedom, a real sense of freedom. There's also throughout basically the French and the German world. Oh, by the way, I want to just be. I'll mention a book. I want to mention a book at the end of class. Throughout the French and the German world, you start to see actually some societies that start to basically take on a little bit more robust role in life. So, for example, some people start to take De La Monnaie's idea seriously, and they say, you know what? Actually, we probably need a Catholic party. What's the purpose of a Catholic party? A Catholic party should be a group of intellectuals and politicians. The intellectuals should know very well the philosophy, the philosophical tradition. And they should work with the politicians to come up with proposals. And also, when now you have this situation, which you had in many countries, where you have royalists who just want to go back to regalism, controlling the church. You have moderate liberals. You have radical liberals. You have these new secret societies of all different forms of radical liberalism. You need some institution for mediating between all of these different groups and saying, well, in this next election that's coming up, what's the most logical step to take? I mean, what makes the most sense as far as the freedom of the church, as far as achieving the common good, because social justice, as we learn about social justice, we're going to discover it makes certain requirements on us, right? I mean, obviously, I don't think Christ and Adam Smith are one on the statement that Adam Smith made that the poor should be happy to be servants at the tables of the rich. Right? So maybe there's a different policy we should try to promote here, right? And maybe we need a Catholic party also because, anyway. So in France, you start to get these circles around this guy, Ozanam, Frederic Ozanam. He's a follower of St. Vincent de Paul. And he basically says we have to do, St. Vincent de Paul, he wanted us to do service for the poor, all this kind of stuff. But with every time we do something for the poor, we should have a conference alongside of it in which we start to explain philosophically or explain in a kind of more academic way what it is we're doing. And could this be an example for a wider, more macro policy of some sort? The Catholics in Belgium, they're able to set up the Louvain. They immediately established in the Louvain a Department of Economics. And the person who's at the head of that department is inspired. He's a student of Lamennais. Also in Belgium, they're able to set up primary and secondary schools. And you start to see also in the 1830s the beginning of a Catholic press. Belloc will write a book about this. It's called The Free Press. Yeah. Well, that book is Belloc's, I think, reflections on the Catholic press, really, that he noted throughout Europe by the time he was living. There's a fellow that emerges in France, a guy named Louis Veuillot. He's actually, there's a statue to him in Rome. He's a layman. There's a statue to him in Rome in the Church of the Miraculous Medal of Rome, Saint Andre de la Fratre, near the old Propaganda Fide office, near Piazza España. And he was a layman, and he became he single-handedly oftentimes had a great influence in French politics as the 19th century progresses. Yeah, it's time. So another good book to read, before we go, I just want to mention, there's another good book to read about all the radical movements of the 19th century, which is written in English. It's by Billington. It's called Fire in the Minds of Men. It gives you, not everything I'm saying is from Billington, but it does give you a kind of picture of a lot of these movements throughout Europe in the 19th century.